Picture this. You're walking down the street, minding your own business, when suddenly you're stopped by two officers demanding to see your ID. You've done nothing wrong, and you know your rights. But what happens when the very people enforcing the law don't seem to know it themselves? That's exactly what went down in today's story, where a routine encounter quickly turned into a surprising lesson in civil liberties and the law. In this episode of *ID Refusal*, we'll explore what happens when female officers push the boundaries of their authority and how standing up for your rights can sometimes lead to moments of tension and even misunderstanding. From misplaced confidence to a shocking twist, this is a story about accountability, knowledge, and the fine line between upholding the law and crossing it. As the situation escalates, you'll witness a battle of wits and words. Who's right? Who's wrong? And how far can things go when the law isn't entirely on their side? Stay tuned, because this one is packed with unexpected turns you won't want to miss. It all started on a quiet afternoon, just like any other. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the street as people moved about their business. But for one man, that normal day took a sharp turn. He had just stepped out of a store when he was approached by two female officers. They were polite at first, asking simple questions about his whereabouts. But things took an unexpected turn when they suddenly demanded to see his ID. Confused, he politely refused. He knew that unless there was a clear reason, he wasn't required to provide it. But instead of letting him go, the officers insisted, their voices growing firmer with each passing moment. "It's just a routine check," one of them said. But something about the way they spoke didn't sit right with him. It felt more like a demand than a request. As the tension in the air thickened, he remained calm, trying to reason with them. He knew the law, and he wasn't going to back down. But the officers weren't backing off either. There was an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of distant traffic. What followed next would leave both sides questioning what had gone wrong and how far things would go before the situation was resolved or further escalated. The officer's insistence was now more than just frustrating. It was starting to feel personal. One of them, a younger officer with a stern expression, took a step closer, her hand resting near her belt. It wasn't threatening, but the shift in her posture wasn't lost on him. Was this intimidation, or just an officer trying to assert control? Either way, the man knew of his rights. He had dealt with enough encounters with law enforcement to know when things were being pushed too far. "Are you detaining me?" he asked, his voice steady but with a hint of frustration creeping in. "If not, I'm free to go, right?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the two women exchanged glances. There was a brief moment of hesitation. The older officer, a bit more experienced but clearly caught in a delicate spot, looked as though she were debating something internally. Then she spoke, her tone a little sharper this time. "We're not asking for trouble," she said, her words laced with a mix of authority and something else. Doubt, maybe? "But you're making this difficult." The tension was palpable now. Was she trying to justify their actions, or was there something deeper at play? Why was she so determined to get his ID when, according to the law, she had no reason to demand it? Meanwhile, the younger officer seemed to grow more agitated, her impatience obvious. With every passing second, the situation felt more charged, like something was about to snap. The man tried to remain calm, but the feeling that something bigger was unfolding hung over him. Were the officers just overzealous in their duty, or was there more to this encounter than met the eye? He wasn't sure, but one thing was certain: this wasn't going to be resolved easily. As the standoff continued, the atmosphere became increasingly charged. The older officer's expression had shifted from authoritative to something else, perhaps doubt or frustration, as if she realized that this wasn't as straightforward as she thought. The younger officer, though, was visibly tense now, her hand twitching near her radio. Her gaze locked onto the man as if daring him to make the wrong move. It was becoming clear. Neither officer wanted to back down, but for different reasons. The man's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't just standing his ground. He was fighting for something bigger. His right to privacy. His right not to be intimidated by the system meant to protect him. He could feel his pulse in his ears, the sound of his own breath steady as he tried to keep control of the situation. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice firm but calm. "I'm not required to show you my ID, and you know it." For a moment, it seemed like the officers were about to break. The older officer turned slightly, as if she were reconsidering, but then the younger one spoke up, her voice sharp and cold. "Enough of this," she snapped. "We're doing this the hard way, then." The words hung in the air like a warning, and for a split second, everything went still. The tension was unbearable. The man could feel his instincts screaming at him to be careful, to prepare for whatever was coming next. Was this the moment things would escalate into something far worse? Would they take him down for simply standing his ground? The questions raced through his mind as his gaze flicked from one officer to the other. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. Just as the younger officer stepped forward, her hand hovering over her radio, a car screeched to a halt nearby. The sudden noise cut through the tension like a knife, and both officers whipped their heads toward the sound. The man, too, turned instinctively, his heart still racing. He wasn't sure whether to be relieved or on edge, but when a third officer, this one male and dressed in plain clothes, stepped out of the car, the entire dynamic shifted. "Everything all right here?" the new officer asked, his tone calm but with an underlying tension that immediately put everyone on alert. The younger officer's posture stiffened, and the older officer hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the unexpected arrival. They exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible look, and it was then that the man realized something. The presence of this third officer wasn't a coincidence. There was a strange energy now, a shift in the air that told him these officers were not working alone. He glanced from one officer to the other, trying to make sense of it. Was this part of a larger operation? Had something else been going on behind the scenes that he didn't know about? The plainclothes officer gave him a sharp look, as if sizing him up, then turned his attention to the two female officers. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his words laced with an edge. The older officer seemed to falter for a moment, her expression unreadable. She took a breath before replying, but before she could explain, the younger officer spoke up, her voice slightly raised, filled with frustration. "This guy's refusing to cooperate," she said. "We need to run his ID." The tension in the air was thick now, each passing second bringing them closer to a breaking point. The man's mind raced. Something wasn't adding up. Why was this third officer here? Was there a bigger plan unfolding that he had no idea about? With every word that was exchanged, the stakes were rising higher, and he could feel the walls closing in. He had to stay calm, but the pressure was mounting, and it was clear. This wasn't just a random encounter anymore. Something much more serious was at play. The air was thick with tension as the plainclothes officer stared down the two female officers, a silent standoff brewing. The man could sense that something was about to break, but he still had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. Just as he was about to speak again, the younger officer's radio crackled to life, cutting through the silence. "Unit 12, report back to base," a voice crackled through. There was a pause before the voice added, "This is a priority." Now. For a split second, the officers froze, and the man's heart skipped a beat. What was so urgent that it had just overridden everything? The older officer's face tightened as she glanced back at her partner, and the plainclothes officer raised an eyebrow, sensing the sudden shift in their demeanor. The younger officer let out a frustrated breath and stepped back. Fine, she muttered under her breath, but her eyes remained locked on the man, as if she still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Before the man could respond, the plainclothes officer spoke up again, this time directing his attention solely to the younger officer. "You need to get back to base." Now, his tone was calm but firm. The authority in his voice brooked no argument. The tension hung in the air as the younger officer reluctantly turned away, muttering under her breath. But as she walked back to the patrol car, the plainclothes officer's eyes remained on the man. He studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, in an unexpected twist, the plainclothes officer glanced back at the older officer and said, "It's him, isn't it?" The older officer didn't answer immediately, her gaze flicking nervously toward the man. There was a moment of silence before she spoke, her voice low. "He doesn't know." The words hit like a thunderclap. The man felt his chest tighten. What were they talking about? Who was he really? And why was he caught in the middle of something so much bigger than a simple ID check? Before he could ask, the older officer motioned for him to leave. "Get out of here," she said, her voice softer now, almost resigned. The man, still reeling from the unexpected turn of events, didn't need to be told twice. He backed away slowly, not knowing whether to feel relieved or more unsettled than ever. As he turned and walked down the street, his mind was racing. The puzzle pieces were scattered everywhere, but none of them seemed to fit together just yet. All he knew was that his encounter with these officers had just been the tip of an iceberg, and there was something much darker lying beneath the surface. As the man walked away, the weight of the encounter hung heavy on his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stumbled into something much more complicated than a simple misunderstanding with the police. The vague comments, the urgency in the officer's actions, it all pointed to a deeper story, one that he wasn't a part of, but had somehow gotten caught in the middle of. Days passed, and the incident remained at the back of his mind. He tried to go about his life, but there was a lingering question. What was it that the officers were hiding? Why had they acted the way they did? It wasn't until he stumbled across a news story a week later that the pieces started to fall into place. The officers had been part of a larger investigation into a network of corruption within the department. The younger officer had been too eager to enforce the law, but the older officer knew exactly what was at stake. The realization hit him hard. What seemed like an overzealous encounter was actually a brush with something far more sinister. The man never did find out the full story, but he knew one thing for sure. Sometimes the truth is buried beneath layers of fear, secrecy, and even those meant to protect you. And in this case, he'd just gotten a glimpse of it.